This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We look more now at the Russian arms dealer who the U.S. exchanged for Brittany Griner. Viktor Bout, a former Soviet military officer who became rich as an arms dealer, is known as the Merchant of Death. He was serving a 25-year prison sentence in the United States for conspiracy to commit terrorism. Our next guest is a former United Nations arms trafficking investigator who says the case allowed American companies to avoid exposure of their collusion with the U.S. government and private companies linked to then Vice President Dick Cheney during the Iraq War, even after UN sanctions against him in 2004. Authorities say Viktor Bout was involved in trafficking arms to dictators, stoking conflicts in Africa, South America, and the Middle East. He's also been accused of furnishing weapons to al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and achieved particular notoriety for selling arms in Rwanda in 1998, just 4 years after the Rwandan genocide. Before he was sentenced in 2012, Viktor Bout spoke to Voice of Russia and said arms suppliers in the U.S. should be in prison, too.
I'm innocent. I don't commit any crime. There is no crime to sit and talk. If you're going to apply the same, standards to me, then you're going to, jail all those arms dealers in America who are selling their arms and ending up killing Americans. They are involved even more than me.
That was over a decade ago, in 2012, when Viktor Bout was sentenced. He spent 11 years so far in jail before being traded for Brittany Griner back to Russia. We're joined now by Kathy Lynn Austin, the former UN arms trafficking investigator, executive director of the Conflict Awareness Project, dedicated to tracking global weapons traffickers and exposing the illicit world of war profiteering. We spoke to you when Viktor Bout was sentenced a decade ago. Now he's been released in a prisoner swap. The former federal judge who sentenced him in 2011 thought his 11 years behind bars was adequate punishment. Judge Shira Scheindlin told the Associated Press in July he's done enough time for what he did in this case. She reaffirmed this, speaking out yesterday. Kathy, welcome back to Democracy Now! Your response to Viktor Bout's release?
Well, of course, as a human rights investigator, excited and celebrating with Brittany Griner's family that she is finally brought home free. She was a pawn a political pawn for Putin, who wanted Viktor Bout back home ever since Viktor Bout had been arrested, ever since he'd been convicted and put in prison. He was the #1 sort of talk on the table between Russia and the U.S. whenever there was a foreign policy meeting between the two countries. But it is such a difficult time for those of us who are aware of how Viktor Bout can be easily deployed in war zone and conflict zones, Ukraine, by Putin again. He is a personified weapon of mass destruction, and he has always proven himself ready, willing, and able.
So if you can talk about what the media is talking about right now, what Viktor Bout was involved with, and what they're not talking about. I mean, selling arms to al-Qaeda and to the Taliban, among other things. Said he was involved in selling arms to those who would kill Americans as well. If you can talk about that record, but also this guy is transnational. And talk about his involvement with the U.S. government and the U.S. government paying him, what came out in the trial, what didn't, and what his involvement with Vice President Cheney, Halliburton, and the Iraq War was all about.
Well, Viktor Bout never had any particular allegiance to any government, to any ideology. Viktor Bout was all about profiting. He was all about using pilots and planes and being the Federal Express of weapons into any conflict zone where he could make a profit. Even while he was on sanctions, U.S. sanctions, UN sanctions, EU sanctions, he still managed through stealth means to evade those sanctions, to bust them. And it was during the war in Iraq when he pulled the wool over the eyes of the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and he was used for approximately 140 flights of bringing in logistical supplies for the U.S. while he used that cover in order to supply weapons to the enemy that we were fighting at the time. So we are talking about a very maniacal and a very sophisticated arms dealer, and he's one that, being on the loose again, should cause a lot of concern from a national security perspective, but from a human rights perspective as well.
And the U.S. government paying him? He is very clear about this. He said, if they're going to put me in prison, you should understand how many millions of dollars I've been paid by them.
Well, he was, as I mentioned, on the employ, and he was a arms trafficker, a profiteer, working for many, many different sides of conflict wherever he could make money. But the important thing now is that we need to use the release of Viktor Bout as a lightning rod. We need to use this as an opportunity to mitigate any national security threat that Viktor Bout still poses to the U.S. and its allies, and for the U.S. to be more proactive in preventing illicit global arms trafficking. That is really what I am hoping will come about from the release of Viktor Bout, that we can get the sporting community, that we can get the White House and Congress to take a deep, hard look now at this problem of these illegal arms traffickers and use this as an opportunity to box them in.
And if you can talk about the U.S. government saying now that they have deemed he is not a threat to the United States, and also how he was ultimately trapped in Thailand. You see these images of DEA taking him in. But that gives you the sense that it was the U.S. that was opposed to him. They did trap him. But talk about the Colombian and Guatemalan military folks that they were working with, who were also criminals themselves.
Well, the DEA and the Department of Justice and law enforcement ran a very serious operation to bring Viktor Bout to justice. He was a menace, not only to the United States then, and a menace to our allies. Viktor Bout had been operating in every country from Colombia to Afghanistan to Rwanda. He has literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deaths on his hand. So the U.S. finally was enabled, used taxpayers' money and resources to bring Viktor Bout to justice. And that was a great day to take this one monster out of the equation. It went a long way for world peace and stability in the areas where Viktor Bout was operating. But the problem with these illegal arms traffickers, and the reason why they're sort of uniquely unregulated, or why we don't really give enough attention to them. We have a czar for drug trafficking. We don't have any czar looking at the problem of global arms traffickers, which is something I've been discussing with the administration, with Congress. We need to start thinking about taking steps in that direction, because they don't have allegiances, they don't have loyalties. But the issue now with Viktor Bout, having Putin having brought him home, he will now serve as Putin's #1 asset. He will be weaponized, and he knows how to sanctions bust. And he will be very proactive in Ukraine. And so that's where I would expect Viktor Bout to use his skills just at a time when Western sanctions are beginning to cripple Russia and Russia's military. You're going to have the likes and ilks of Viktor Bout. So I think we need to use this as a lightning rod opportunity so that there isn't collateral damage from this incredible release of Brittany Griner and this prisoner swap, and that instead we put in place very tight controls, not only on foreign arms traffickers, but also domestic ones. We have, the sort of main source of weapons into Mexico. And part of the reason why we have so much trouble on our border is a result of a lot of the U.S. arms going illegally into Mexico. So let's use this as an opportunity to create and put in place new measures to stop these global arms traffickers,
Overall,
whether they're operating in U.S. soil or in other places.
Kathy, overall, the involvement of the U.S. in the international arms trade, is it number one when it comes to arms sales? And how does that affect the global discussion and the interference with treaties that would stem this?
Well, I think we have to look at arms trade there's sort of three different categories here. You have the legal arms trade, legal transfers, which the U.S. is the number one, but goes through very specific channels. We also have the gray market, which is kind of where Viktor Bout fit in, where governments will use these illegal arms traffickers when they need them to carry out national security operations or clandestine operations in other countries. And then there is the black market. So the gray market, the black market, we need to tighten up. That is kind of where the work that the Conflict Awareness Project is engaged, is looking at the illegal traffickers. And then we do need to do more about reducing legal arms flows, especially to human rights abusing regimes and conflict areas around the globe.
Kathy Lynn Austin, I want to thank you so much for being with us, former UN arms trafficking investigator, executive director of the Conflict Awareness Project, dedicated to tracking global weapons traffickers, exposing illicit world of war profiteering. Next up, we look at the assassination of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. As well, we look at the visit between Chinese President Xi and the Saudi Crown Prince. Stay with us.